The water is black glass beneath a moonless Pacific sky. Commander Tamon Yamaguchi stands on the bridge of the carrier Hiryū, his breath visible in the cold air above the Philippine Sea. It's March 1944. The stars stretch endlessly overhead, indifferent and ancient. Somewhere beyond the horizon, beyond the curvature of the Earth itself, America is building something his intelligence officers insist is impossible. A carrier in 12 months. He'd laughed when he first read the report. The Americans, those soft merchants obsessed with jazz and automobiles, constructing a fleet carrier, a floating city of steel, wire, and aviation fuel, in the time it takes to grow a single crop? Preposterous. His own Hiryū had taken 4 years to complete. The mighty Yamato, pride of the Imperial Navy, had consumed 6 years of labor and resources that strained even Japan's devoted industrial base. But the reports keep coming. Not one carrier. 7, 12, 24. The numbers make no sense. They violate every principle of shipbuilding, every lesson learned from centuries of naval engineering. Yet American radio intercepts are clear. Reconnaissance photographs, smuggled through neutral channels, show skeletal hulls rising from shipyards that didn't exist 2 years ago. Yards built specifically for this impossible task. Yamaguchi grips the railing, knuckles white against painted steel. Below him, his crew sleeps in tight bundles, dreaming of Yokohama, of Osaka, of wives and children they haven't seen in 18 months. They don't know what he knows. They don't carry the weight of mathematics that refuses to balance. Japan started this war with 10 carriers. America had 7. Now, in the spring of 1944, Japan has 4 carriers operational. Damaged, undermanned, desperately conserving fuel and aircraft. The Americans. Intelligence suggests they have over 30 fleet and light carriers at sea. More are being commissioned every month. Some launched just 9 months after their keels were laid. 9 months. The same time it takes a human child to form in the womb, the Americans are birthing warships. Yamaguchi exhales slowly, watching his breath dissolve into darkness. There's a word his academy instructors use to describe nations that misunderstand their enemies: horobairu. Doomed. Not through cowardice or poor tactics, but through fundamental miscalculation. Through believing that what you cannot do, your enemy cannot do either. The ocean whispers against the hull, patient and endless. Somewhere out there, beyond the black water, beyond the reach of his spotters and scouts, a fleet is coming that shouldn't exist. Built by methods that shouldn't work. Crewed by pilots who learn to fly in months, not years. An industrial tsunami that will drown everything he's fought to protect. And the most terrifying part? They're not even hurrying anymore. December 7, 1941, began as Japan's masterstroke and ended as its most catastrophic miscalculation. When Vice Admiral Chuchi Nagumo's 6 carriers launched 353 aircraft toward Pearl Harbor, Japanese military planners believed they understood their enemy completely. America was vast, yes, sprawling and wealthy, but surely too comfortable, too divided, too civilian to wage total war. The attack would cripple the Pacific Fleet, force a negotiated peace, and secure Japan's Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere before American industry could fully mobilize. They had studied American culture. Jazz music, Hollywood films, labor strikes and political squabbles broadcast openly on radio. To Japanese officers trained in Bushido and absolute dedication, Americans seemed soft, individualistic, addicted to pleasure. How could such people compete with warriors who would gladly die for their emperor? Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of Pearl Harbor, knew better. "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve," he allegedly said, though no written record confirms it. What is confirmed? Yamamoto studied at Harvard. He served as a naval attaché in Washington. He'd seen Detroit's automobile factories, Pittsburgh's steel mills, the massive oil refineries of Texas. He understood that American industrial capacity wasn't just larger than Japan's, it was different in kind. But Yamamoto's warnings were drowned beneath waves of early victory. In 6 months, Japan conquered an empire stretching from Burma to the Gilbert Islands. They controlled resources worth fighting for: oil from the Dutch East Indies, rubber from Malaya, rice from Indochina. Their carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryū, Shokaku, Zuikaku, had dominated every engagement. At Midway, they expected another triumph. Instead, they lost 4 carriers in a single day. June 4, 1942. The turning point that Japanese planners would analyze obsessively for decades afterward, searching for the tactical errors, the intelligence failures, the moments where fortune betrayed them. But they were looking in the wrong place. Midway wasn't lost through bad luck or poor coordination. It was lost the moment Japan decided it could outproduce America in a war of industrial attrition. Consider the mathematics of hubris. In 1940, America produced 4,680 aircraft. Japan produced 4,768. Nearly equal. Japan's naval architects celebrated this near parity, seeing it as validation of their modernization programs. But quantity obscured quality, and statistics obscured capacity. American factories were running at partial capacity, producing civilian goods, operating single shifts. They were designed to scale. Japanese factories, by contrast, were already operating near maximum output, straining supply chains that stretched across occupied territories. By 1944, America would produce 96,318 aircraft in a single year. Japan would produce 28,180, already an enormous strain on resources, manpower, and raw materials. They were building more planes than ever before, yet falling further behind with every passing month. It wasn't a race anymore. It was arithmetic expressing itself in aluminum, steel, and blood. But aircraft were only part of the equation. Carriers, those massive floating fortresses that projected air power across oceans, were the true measure of naval dominance. They took years to build, required specialized shipyards, demanded huge quantities of steel plate, turbines, electrical systems, aviation fuel storage, and crews trained in the intricate choreography of launching and recovering aircraft at sea. Building a fleet carrier was among the most complex industrial undertakings of the pre-nuclear age. Japan started the war with 10 carriers. They could build, at best, 1 new fleet carrier every 18 months, and that was before American submarines began strangling their merchant fleet, cutting off oil, steel, and aluminum from conquered territories. America started with 7 carriers. Then something impossible happened. Something that would redefine what industrialized warfare meant. Something that Japanese admirals, staring at reconnaissance photographs in late 1943, simply refused to believe until it was far too late. Henry J. Kaiser had never built a ship before Pearl Harbor. He was a road builder. A dam constructor. The man who helped create the Hoover Dam and the Grand Coulee Dam, those massive monuments to American concrete and ambition. He understood deadlines, efficiency, and how to organize thousands of workers into synchronized purpose. But ships, naval vessels, carriers that would need to survive typhoons and torpedo strikes? The Navy brass laughed at him. Shipbuilding is an art, they told him, with the condescension that experts reserve for ambitious amateurs. It takes decades to master. You can't simply mass-produce warships like automobiles. Kaiser smiled and disagreed. On January 14, 1941, 11 months before Pearl Harbor, Kaiser and a handful of other industrialists met with President Franklin Roosevelt. The president wanted ships. Liberty ships to carry cargo, tankers to transport oil, and eventually, if war came, warships to carry the fight westward. Traditional shipyards said they could build perhaps 1 large vessel every year or 2. Kaiser proposed something radical: assembly line shipbuilding using prefabricated sections, welding instead of riveting, simplified designs that traded elegance for speed. The Navy Department called it crude and temporary. Kaiser called it necessary. When the carriers Lexington and Yorktown slipped beneath Pacific waters at Coral Sea and Midway, America's carrier fleet shrank to 3 operational flattops: Enterprise, Saratoga, and Ranger. Japan, despite losing 4 at Midway, still fielded 5 operational carriers. The mathematics of naval warfare suddenly looked terrifyingly bleak. Admiral Ernest King, Chief of Naval Operations, faced a grim calculation. Building fleet carriers through traditional methods meant 3 to 4 years from keel laying to commissioning. At that pace, Japan could potentially win the Pacific War before American shipyards could replace losses. Even if America eventually outbuilt Japan, which was certain, would it happen fast enough to matter? Enter the Essex-class carrier program, and more revolutionary, the Independence-class light carriers. These weren't Kaiser's projects initially. The Navy itself had begun designing the Essex-class in 1939, anticipating war. But peacetime design assumptions, careful craftsmanship, traditional methods, sequential construction, had to be abandoned overnight. Everything about American shipbuilding culture had to transform. And it did, with terrifying speed. Shipyards that built cruise ships retooled for war production. Yards that didn't exist in 1940 rose from California mud and Virginia marshland. Newport News, Norfolk, Philadelphia, Quincy, and Camden became crucibles where raw materials transformed into floating airbases faster than anyone thought possible. The secret wasn't magic. It was method. Traditional shipbuilding meant constructing the hull first, then installing internal systems sequentially, a process requiring thousands of workers to coordinate in cramped spaces. The new American approach broke ships into prefabricated modules built simultaneously in different parts of the shipyard. Entire sections, complete with wiring, piping, and equipment, were assembled on the ground where workers could stand upright, use proper tools, and work in parallel. Then came the welding revolution. For centuries, ships had been riveted, metal plates fastened with hundreds of thousands of individual rivets, each hammered into place by hand. Welding was considered risky, potentially creating weak joints that would crack under stress. But welding was also fast. Enormously fast. And when done correctly, welding created seams actually stronger than riveted joints. American shipyards trained tens of thousands of welders. Women, primarily, Wendy the Welder, propaganda posters called them, who learned the trade in weeks and applied it with precision born from repetition. Production lines that once moved at the pace of hammers now moved at the pace of electric arcs. Liberty ships, those ugly, practical cargo vessels, began rolling out in astonishing numbers. The SS Robert E. Peary was built in 4 days and 15 hours, from keel laying to launching. Not commissioned, not ready for combat, but structurally complete and floating. It was a publicity stunt, yes, but one that demonstrated a fundamental shift in manufacturing philosophy. If you could build a cargo ship in days, what could you do with months? The Essex-class carriers weren't cargo ships. They displaced 27,000 tons, carried 100 aircraft, required 2,600 crew members, and demanded sophisticated electronics, steam catapults, and armor that could withstand punishment. They were floating cities of organized violence. Yet the first Essex-class carrier, USS Essex itself, went from keel-laying to commissioning in just 20 months. That was still too slow. So the Navy improvised. They found 9 partially completed cruiser hulls, Cleveland-class light cruisers already under construction, and made a radical decision. Strip away the cruiser superstructure. Add a flight deck. Install elevators and hangar spaces. Create a smaller, lighter carrier that sacrificed aircraft capacity for construction speed. The Independence-class light carrier was born. USS Independence took just 14 months from conversion start to commissioning. More importantly, the concept worked. These weren't temporary stopgaps or training vessels. They were combat-ready carriers that could operate with a fleet, launch strikes, and survive battle damage. And America was building them faster than Japan could sink them. Much faster. By mid-1943, a new carrier was being commissioned every month. Sometimes two. The industrial tsunami wasn't coming. It had already arrived. To understand what America built, you must first understand what Japan couldn't. Japan in 1941 was an industrial nation, modern, militarized, and sophisticated. They defeated Russia in 1905, shocked the world with their naval victories, and built carriers that were, ton for ton, among the finest in the world. Japanese optics were superior. Their naval architects understood fluid dynamics and structural engineering. The legendary Zero fighter was faster, more maneuverable, and had longer range than any American fighter at the war's start. But Japan's industrial capacity had a ceiling built from geography and resources. Japan's entire steel production in 1941 was approximately 7 million tons annually. America produced 75 million tons. Japan had to import nearly all of its oil, iron ore, and bauxite from conquered territories thousands of miles away, transported by merchant ships increasingly vulnerable to submarine attack. America swam in oil, mined its own ore, and turned the Midwest into an endless breadbasket. Few people today realize the sheer scale of American production expansion between 1941 and 1945. Consider a single example: aluminum. This lightweight metal, essential for aircraft construction, required enormous amounts of electricity to refine from bauxite ore. Japan, with limited hydroelectric capacity and coal-burning plants, struggled to produce enough aluminum for its aircraft needs. America built the Grand Coulee Dam in Washington and the Fontana Dam in North Carolina specifically to power aluminum refineries. By 1943, the U.S. was producing more aluminum in a single month than Japan produced in an entire year. But raw materials were only the foundation. The real story was organization, the systematic transformation of American capitalism into a directed economic weapon. On January 16, 1942, just weeks after Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt established the War Production Board. Its mandate was simple and total: convert American industry from civilian to military production with maximum speed and efficiency. Automobile factories stopped making cars. Ford's Willow Run plant in Michigan, designed to mass-produce B-24 Liberator bombers, became the largest factory building in the world, covering 3.5 million square feet. At peak production, Willow Run completed one B-24 bomber every 63 minutes. One bomber per hour, rolling off an assembly line like automobiles. Japanese aircraft, by contrast, were still being assembled by teams of craftsmen, each plane a semi-custom creation requiring weeks of labor. General Motors stopped building Chevrolets and started building tanks, aircraft engines, and naval weapons. Chrysler built the Arsenal of Democracy in Detroit, a tank manufacturing plant that produced 25,000 tanks during the war. Packard built Rolls-Royce Merlin engines under license. Even Steinway & Sons, the piano manufacturer, stopped making pianos and started making glider parts. This wasn't gradual conversion. It was economic metamorphosis. American women flooded into the workforce. Rosie the Riveter became the icon, but she represented millions of real women. 6 million women who'd never worked in factories before entering the production lines in 1942 and 1943. They welded hulls, assembled aircraft wings, operated cranes, read blueprints, and did it all while their husbands, brothers, and sons fought overseas. Japan, meanwhile, maintained traditional gender roles even as its military situation deteriorated. Japanese women weren't mobilized for factory work on a massive scale until far too late. This wasn't sexism alone, it was cultural inflexibility colliding with existential war. When you need to double your production but refuse to double your workforce, mathematics becomes destiny. The numbers tell a story that still seems impossible. 1941 American production: 19,433 aircraft, 4,052 tanks, 0 escort carriers. 1943 American production: 85,898 aircraft, 29,497 tanks, 50 escort carriers. That's not a typo. 50 escort carriers in a single year. Small carriers, yes, built on merchant hulls, carrying fewer aircraft, but combat-capable, ocean-going vessels that could hunt submarines, support amphibious landings, and ferry aircraft across the Pacific. Japan built 2 light carriers in 1943. The Essex-class fleet carrier program epitomized this industrial philosophy. Rather than building each carrier as a unique vessel, traditional naval practice, the Navy standardized the design and built all Essex-class ships to identical specifications. This allowed shipyards to share blueprints, techniques, and prefabricated components. Workers who learned to assemble one Essex could transfer to another yard and immediately contribute. Suppliers knew exactly what specifications to meet. It was naval architecture by assembly line. Between 1942 and 1945, America commissioned 24 Essex-class carriers. Not one every few years, but batches arriving in rapid succession. USS Yorktown II, named for the carrier lost at Midway, commissioned in April 1943. USS Intrepid commissioned in August 1943. USS Hornet II, replacing the carrier lost at Santa Cruz, commissioned in November 1943. USS Franklin in January 1944. Month after month after month, new carriers joined the fleet. Each one carried 100 aircraft. Each one represented 27,000 tons of steel, thousands of miles of wiring, complex steam turbines, radar systems, damage control equipment, ammunition magazines, aviation fuel tanks, and crew accommodations. Each one was a floating city that cost roughly $70 million in 1940s dollars, about $1 billion today. And America was building them faster than Japan could comprehend. Japanese intelligence officers stared at reconnaissance photographs and assumed errors in translation. Their own carrier construction took years. The massive Shinano, converted from a Yamato-class battleship hull, would take 3 years to complete and be sunk by a submarine 10 days after commissioning, the largest warship ever sunk by submarine. By the time Shinano slipped beneath the waves in November 1944, America had more carriers at sea than Japan had built in its entire history. The sleeping giant hadn't just awakened. It had industrialized its rage. Lieutenant Commander Takeo Shibata first saw them through binoculars on a gray November morning in 1943. He was stationed at Rabaul, the fortress base in New Britain that had once seemed impregnable, protected by jungle, distance, and the finest naval pilots Japan had ever trained. Now those pilots were mostly dead. Their replacements, rushed through abbreviated training, survived an average of 3 missions before being shot down by American fighters that seemed to multiply like bacteria. But it was the ships that stopped Shibata's breath. Carriers. American carriers. Not 1 or 2 accompanying a task force, but 6 fleet carriers operating together, their aircraft forming a steel cloud that blotted out the tropical sun. He watched through the binoculars as F-6F Hellcats stacked up in layers, providing combat air patrol while Dauntless dive bombers and Avenger torpedo bombers hammered Japanese positions with methodical precision. This wasn't the American Navy he'd studied at the academy. That Navy had been cautious, conservative, protective of its few precious carriers. After losing Lexington, Yorktown, Wasp, and Hornet in 1942, American carrier operations had become tentative, quick strikes followed by rapid retreats. The Americans couldn't afford to lose what few carriers remained. Now they attacked like they had carriers to spare. Because they did. Shibata lowered his binoculars and felt the ground shift beneath him, metaphorically and literally. American bombs were rearranging Rabaul's landscape, collapsing tunnels, igniting fuel dumps, turning the mighty fortress into a tomb. But worse than the physical destruction was the psychological revelation crystallizing in his mind. Japan couldn't win this. Couldn't possibly win this. Not through better tactics, not through superior training, not through the indomitable warrior spirit they'd been taught since childhood. The Americans had solved warfare through industrial production. They'd turned combat into mathematics, and mathematics didn't care about courage or sacrifice or divine wind. The reports confirmed what his eyes told him. USS Essex, Yorktown 2, Lexington 2, Bunker Hill, Intrepid, Independence, Belleau Wood, Princeton, Cowpens, names that meant nothing 6 months ago, carriers that didn't exist a year ago, now forming task forces that roamed the Pacific with impunity. Japanese submarines occasionally sighted them. Japanese scout planes sometimes photographed them before being shot down. But sinking them, stopping them. Every time Japan managed to damage an American carrier, 2 more appeared to replace it. USS Yorktown 2, damaged at Marcus Island, returned to service in 4 weeks after repairs at Pearl Harbor. 4 weeks. Japanese carriers, when damaged, sailed back to Japan, if they made it, and spent months in dry dock competing for repair resources with damaged battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. The American carriers kept coming, kept launching strikes, kept appearing in new areas before Japanese intelligence could track their movements. It was like fighting an enemy that could teleport, that could multiply, that treated massive warships as disposable assets. At Imperial Navy headquarters in Tokyo, Admiral Manaichi Koga, who'd replaced Yamamoto after his death, studied the intelligence reports with growing dread. His staff had compiled a list, confirmed American carriers, probable American carriers, and carriers under construction based on aerial reconnaissance of American shipyards. The confirmed list alone was devastating, 18 fleet and light carriers operational. The probable list added another dozen. The construction list suggested 15 more carriers in various stages of completion. Koga did the mathematics. Even assuming Japan sank one American carrier per month, an impossibly optimistic projection, America would commission new carriers faster than Japan could destroy them. And that assumed Japan's own carrier force remained static, which it wouldn't. Shokaku had been torpedoed. Taiho, their newest and most advanced carrier, was still working up. Zuikaku was short of trained pilots. Japan had 6 operational carriers. America had 18 and growing. The revelation wasn't that America was winning. The revelation was that Japan had already lost, back in December 1941, the moment they attacked Pearl Harbor. Everything since then had been the slow-motion unfolding of an inevitable conclusion, camouflaged by early victories that meant nothing in the context of industrial capacity. "We awakened something," Koga said quietly to his staff, echoing Yamamoto's alleged words. "We thought we were fighting a nation. We were fighting a factory." But it was worse than that, though Koga didn't yet fully understand it. America wasn't just outbuilding Japan. It was outbuilding Japan while simultaneously fighting Nazi Germany, supplying the Soviet Union through Lend-Lease, feeding Great Britain, and producing enough domestic goods that American civilians never experienced true rationing. Japanese civilians were eating rice mixed with sawdust. American civilians were dealing with sugar rationing and tire shortages. The revelation spread through the Japanese officer corps like radiation, silent, invisible, fatal. Young officers still spoke of victory, of special attack tactics, of bleeding the Americans until they sued for peace. Older officers, those who understood logistics and industrial capacity, began speaking in quieter tones about minimizing loss, preserving what remained, preparing for the inevitable. By the time USS Intrepid launched strikes against Truk in February 1944, obliterating Japan's Gibraltar of the Pacific, the psychological war was already over. The shooting would continue for another 17 months. But the outcome had been determined in American shipyards, by workers who never saw combat, who welded steel and drove rivets and turned a sleeping nation into an industrial leviathan that history had never witnessed before. And would, perhaps, never witness again. June 19, 1944. The Philippine Sea. The last great carrier battle of World War II begins at dawn. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa commands the Japanese First Mobile Fleet, 5 fleet carriers, 4 light carriers, and supporting battleships that include the mighty Yamato and Musashi. It's the largest concentration of Japanese naval power since Midway, assembled for a single desperate purpose: stop the American invasion of the Mariana Islands. Ozawa has a plan. A good plan, actually. His carriers can launch aircraft 300 miles from the American fleet, beyond the range of American carrier aircraft. His planes will strike first, refuel at captured airfields in the Marianas, rearm, and strike again on the return journey. The Americans, forced to close range to launch their shorter-range aircraft, will be vulnerable. It's the classic naval tactic: hit hard from beyond retaliation range. On paper, it could work. In reality, it's 1944, and paper calculations no longer matter. Admiral Raymond Spruance commands Task Force 58, 7 fleet carriers, 8 light carriers, 15 carriers, 15 floating cities of aircraft, radar, and anti-aircraft guns. More carriers in a single task force than Japan deployed during Pearl Harbor. More carriers than Japan currently has in its entire navy. The battle begins with Japanese scout planes sighting the American fleet. Ozawa smiles. The trap can now be sprung. He launches 430 aircraft in 4 massive waves, nearly every flyable aircraft on his carriers. They thunder eastward toward the Americans, expecting to find a cautious, defensive fleet huddled around perhaps 3 or 4 carriers. Instead, they fly into hell. American radar picks up the first wave 150 miles out. F-6F Hellcat fighters scramble from 15 carrier decks simultaneously. 70 Hellcats in the air within minutes. Then 100. Then 200. The sky fills with American fighters stacking in layers: high cover, medium cover, low cover, a vertical wall of aircraft guided by radar controllers who can see Japanese formations like chess pieces on a board. The Japanese pilots, many with less than 6 months training, fly into this wall at high speed and never come out. What follows isn't a battle. Its execution. American pilots, trained for 2 years, flying superior aircraft, guided by radar, and supported by abundant fuel and ammunition, tear through Japanese formations with methodical efficiency. Hellcats flame Zeros. Zeros flame under their own burning fuel. Aircraft spiral into the sea trailing smoke, pilots screaming or already dead, their sacrifice meaningless against the industrial arithmetic they're fighting. On Ozawa's carriers, deck crews prepare to recover aircraft that will never return. The first wave launches 69 aircraft. 8 return. The second wave launches 130 aircraft. 31 return, many so shot up they crash on landing. The third wave, confused by navigation errors, finds the American fleet by accident and is slaughtered. The fourth wave never even reaches the Americans, intercepted so far out that some Japanese pilots run out of fuel trying to return, ditching in the ocean. American pilots, after landing and rearming, describe it casually: it was like an old-time turkey shoot. The Battle of the Philippine Sea would forever after be called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. But the killing isn't finished. American submarines, lurking beneath the Philippine Sea, detect Ozawa's carriers. At 9:22 a.m., USS Albacore fires a spread of 6 torpedoes at Taiho, Japan's newest, most advanced carrier, the ship that was supposed to represent Japan's technological revival. 1 torpedo hits. Just 1. But Taiho's damage control officer makes a fatal error, ordering ventilation systems to full power to clear gasoline fumes from a ruptured fuel line. Instead of clearing the fumes, the ventilation system spreads them throughout the ship. At 3:32 p.m., a spark ignites the gasoline vapor. Taiho explodes from within, a massive fireball that rips through every deck, immolates crew in their stations, and breaks the carrier's back. She sinks at 3:32 p.m., taking 1,650 men to the bottom. 3 hours later, USS Kavala torpedoes Shokaku, the veteran carrier that had attacked Pearl Harbor, fought at Coral Sea, survived countless battles. 4 torpedoes punch through her hull. Aviation fuel ignites. Fires spread to bomb magazines. At 3:01 p.m., Shokaku explodes and capsizes, killing 1,263 crew. 2 fleet carriers lost to submarines while the air battle raged overhead. Ozawa doesn't yet know. He's still trying to recover his shattered air groups, still believing he can regroup and attack again tomorrow. His staff reports losses as moderate, because the alternative, admitting they've lost 350 aircraft and 445 aircrewmen in a single day, is too catastrophic to voice. That night, American Task Force 58 turns west and pursues. The next evening, American scout planes locate Ozawa's fleeing fleet at maximum range. Admiral Mark Mitcher makes the decision: launch a strike at extreme range, knowing his pilots will have to land in darkness, many running out of fuel. It's a decision only possible with abundant carriers. Ozawa's remaining carriers, Zuikaku, Hiryū, Junyo, and the light carriers Ryuho and Chiyoda, try to defend themselves. Hiryū takes bombs and torpedoes, explodes, and sinks with 250 crew. 2 oilers are destroyed. More aircraft burn. The remaining Japanese carriers flee westward into darkness, pursued by shadows. By June 21st, the battle is over. Japan has lost 3 carriers, 395 carrier aircraft, 200 land-based aircraft, and over 3,000 aircrew. America has lost 123 aircraft and 109 aircrew. 3 carriers versus 0 carriers. The mathematics of industrial warfare, expressed in fire and blood. Silence settles over the Philippine Sea like ash. The water is littered with debris, shattered aircraft wings, empty life rafts, oil slicks that burn with rainbow colors under the tropical sun. American destroyers pluck Japanese pilots from the water, young men, often teenagers, who clutch photographs of families they'll never see again. They're given water, medical treatment, and clean clothes before being imprisoned below deck. Many cry, not from fear, but from shame. They failed. They lost. The American carriers they were supposed to sink still float on the horizon, their aircraft still fill the sky, and the war goes on without them. Vice Admiral Ozawa returns to Japan aboard Zuikaku, his flagship, the last surviving carrier from the Pearl Harbor attack. He doesn't sleep during the voyage. Doesn't eat much. He writes reports in careful kanji, documenting losses, analyzing failures, recommending changes to training programs and tactical doctrines that will never be implemented because Japan no longer has the resources to implement them. At Imperial Navy headquarters in Tokyo, the reports are received in silence. 3 carriers lost. The first mobile fleet, Japan's last offensive naval force, shattered. The Mariana Islands will fall. Saipan will fall. Tinian will fall. And from Tinian, American B-29 bombers will reach the Japanese home islands themselves. The strategic implications unfold like a slow-motion nightmare. Without carriers, Japan cannot defend its merchant fleet. Without merchant shipping, oil from the Dutch East Indies cannot reach Japanese refineries. Without oil, the combined fleet cannot operate. Without the fleet, the island garrisons are isolated. Without resupply, they will starve, fight to the death, or surrender, each option equally catastrophic to Japanese morale. The remaining carriers, Zuikaku, Junyo, Ryuho, Chiyoda, are effectively useless without trained pilots to fly from their decks. The training pipeline has collapsed. Japan is producing aircraft faster than it can train pilots. The pilots it does train have 50 flight hours before combat. American pilots have 300. In August 1944, American forces capture Tinian and Guam. In September, work begins on massive airbases, runways 8,500 feet long, capable of handling fully loaded B-29 superfortresses. Each runway requires thousands of tons of coral and concrete, built by CB construction battalions who work around the clock. The bases rise from jungle and coral like industrial monuments to inevitability. By October 1944, Japan's remaining carriers make their last sortie during the Battle of Leyte Gulf. It's a decoy operation. The carriers have few aircraft, fewer pilots, but their presence might lure American carriers away from Japanese battleships attempting to attack American landing forces. It works. Partially. Admiral William Halsey's Third Fleet spots the Japanese carriers and pursues. In the battle off Cape Engano, American aircraft sink Zuikaku, the last Pearl Harbor veteran, Zuho, Chiyoda, and Chitose. 4 carriers, destroyed in a single battle. They barely fight back. They can't. Their aircraft are already gone, used up, burned away in previous battles. A Japanese officer, watching Zuikaku sink, later wrote, "We died not with a roar but with a whimper, not through defeat but through exhaustion." Meanwhile, American carriers continue operating. USS Franklin survives devastating kamikaze damage in October 1944 and returns to service. USS Enterprise, the Big E, fights in nearly every major Pacific battle and survives the entire war. USS Intrepid, nicknamed the Fighting Eye, gets hit by kamikazes multiple times and keeps returning to combat. The carriers Japan thought were impossible, the carriers Japanese intelligence insisted couldn't be built, the carriers that Japanese captains refused to believe existed until they appeared on the horizon, these carriers form the steel foundation of American victory. By war's end, America has commissioned 141 aircraft carriers, 24 fleet carriers, 9 light carriers, and 108 escort carriers. Japan built 25 carriers total during the entire war, and most were sunk before completing their first combat cruise. The mathematics had spoken. And mathematics, unlike courage or honor or sacrifice, cannot be argued with. There's a photograph taken in Tokyo Bay on September 2, 1945. Hundreds of American warships fill the harbor, destroyers, cruisers, battleships, and in the center, dozens of aircraft carriers. Their decks are lined with sailors in dress whites, watching as Japanese officials board USS Missouri to sign the surrender documents. The carriers are so numerous they fade into the horizon, an armada that represents the most complete industrial victory in human history. Not one of those carriers existed on December 7, 1941. This is the truth that Japanese military planners miscalculated. They assumed American capability matched American culture. They saw jazz clubs and assumed softness. They saw labor disputes and assumed disorganization. They saw individualism and assumed weakness. They attacked a nation they believed lacked the will to fight a protracted war. They were wrong about the will. But more fundamentally, they were wrong about the capacity. America didn't win World War II through superior tactics or better generals or more courage. American soldiers were no braver than Japanese soldiers. American sailors died just as painfully in cold Pacific waters. The ships that went down, Yorktown, Lexington, Hornet, Wasp, carried men who fought with absolute dedication. America won because it could build 3 replacement carriers before the enemy could build one. Because it could lose aircraft at a 2-to-1 ratio and still dominate the skies. Because it had the industrial infrastructure to treat massive warships as replaceable assets rather than precious treasures. This wasn't the way warfare was supposed to work. For centuries, naval power meant careful husbanding of irreplaceable vessels. Losing a capital ship was a strategic disaster. Admirals agonized over committing their fleets to battle because losses couldn't be replaced. Warfare was fundamentally conservative. Protect what you have because you can't build more. America changed that equation. It turned warfare into production statistics. It fought not with what it had, but with what it could build. And it could build faster than any enemy could destroy. Henry Kaiser, the dam builder who became a shipbuilder, proved that expertise wasn't necessary when methodology was sound. The Rosie the riveters, the Wendy the welders, proved that training mattered less than organization. The Essex-class carriers proved that standardization could defeat customization. The Independence-class conversions proved that speed could overcome elegance. Together, they proved that industrial capacity, properly mobilized, is the ultimate military weapon. But here's the part that should terrify us. America hasn't fought another war like this since 1945. Modern America has lost the shipyards, the workforce, the industrial mobilization structures that turned a peacetime economy into a war economy in 18 months. The massive steel mills have closed. The skilled trades have diminished. The supply chains have dispersed globally. The knowledge of how to build complex things quickly, truly quickly, impossibly quickly, has faded into history. Could modern America build a carrier in 12 months? 24 months? Could it build 50 carriers in 4 years? The uncomfortable answer is, probably not. We've optimized for efficiency, for cost reduction, for just-in-time supply chains that eliminate redundancy. We've traded surge capacity for quarterly profits. We've turned manufacturing into something done elsewhere, by someone else, using skills we no longer teach. The Japanese captains who underestimated American industrial capacity made a fatal error. But their error was at least understandable. They simply couldn't imagine production at that scale because nothing in history suggested it was possible. What's our excuse? We've seen what industrial mobilization can accomplish. We have the historical records, the photographs, the statistics. We know that free societies, properly motivated, can outproduce authoritarian regimes. We know that industrial capacity is the foundation of strategic power. Yet we've allowed that capacity to atrophy, assuming that technology can replace production volume, that precision can substitute for scale, that future wars will be quick and surgical rather than grinding and industrial. History suggests otherwise. The carriers that appeared at Japanese shores didn't arrive through miracles. They arrived through welding, riveting, training, organizing, and working. Through millions of individual decisions by workers who believed their labor mattered. Through a society that temporarily set aside profit margins and quarterly earnings to focus on a singular goal. Those carriers represented more than naval power. They represented what a nation could accomplish when it decided that survival required transformation. If you're still here, you value forgotten truths. You understand that history isn't just dates and battles, it's lessons about capacity, will, and the mathematics of power. The story of American carrier production isn't just about World War II. It's about what becomes possible when a society mobilizes its full potential. Keep these truths alive. Remember that the impossible becomes routine when systems align. Remember that underestimating productive capacity is a fatal error. Remember that the sleeping giant, once awakened, built carriers faster than enemies could comprehend. And remember this final image. Commander Tamon Yamaguchi, standing on the bridge of Hiryū in March 1944, watching the horizon for carriers that shouldn't exist. The engines silent. The reports impossible. The mathematics undeniable. The carriers came anyway. They always do. When a nation with limitless resources decides that victory requires production, production happens. When engineers, welders, and workers align toward a common purpose, impossibility becomes memory. The water is black glass beneath the Pacific sky. The engines are silent now, but their lesson echoes still.